my name is Azet Chavez, and our review project is on Unit 6 Imperialism and Progressivism. There are many factors that led to the creation of the Populist Party. One was the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, which was formed in 1867, and it was a support system for struggling Western farmers. The other was the Farmers' Alliance that was created in 1877, which was also a support for the farmers during the 1880s, and that finally led to the founding of the Populist Party, or also known as the People's Party, in 1891. And they wanted to create legislation that benefited the working class. They achieved their goals through the Democratic Party, and in the Omaha Platform of 1891, the Populists favored free coinage of silver, graduated income tax, and transportation. And this inspired the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment. The Progressive era started in 1890 and ended in 1920. It began in 1890 until the U.S. involvement in World War I. It was a reaction to the Gilded Age economic and social problems, and many people wanted to fix this, but they believed that the government should be more involved in the reforms that were led to solve the problems from the Gilded Age. The Progressives. Muckrakers were progressives, and they were journalists that brought attention to the problems in society. Many people that were involved were people such as Ida Tarbell, and Ida B. Tarbell, which was an African American who showed the problems of lynching and how it was used to control slaves. Another person who was involved was Upton Sinclair with his novel The Jungle, and The Jungle depicted the gruesome working conditions in the meat industries, and thus that created the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. While the muckrakers were journalists that informed people of the dirty realities and conditions of factories and slums, the temperance movement was mostly supported by women, and they wanted to encourage the moderation of drinking of alcohol. Alcohol was blamed for many of society's problems. Carrie Nation was one of the radical members of the temperance movement. Other organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Movement and the Anti-Saloon League were created to support and to try to stop the drinking of alcohol. And they were very successful with the 18th Amendment, which was the prohibition of alcohol. The social gospel was something that Christians believed it was a Christian duty to improve the conditions in cities. They did this through various organizations such as the Salvation Army, YMCA, or charities that they held to improve people's lives and to help those that were in much need. Jane Addams was one of these people who helped the people that were in need and who created the Whole House of 1889, which was a service for immigrants and for the poor, and it was in the Chicago slums, and she became a model for the women's involvement in urban and social reforms. Women's suffrage first started with the Sakina Fall Convention in 1848, and they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments where they expressed how they wanted more rights just like men. NASA was created during this time, the 1920s, to get the women the right to vote. Women did this by going state by state, holding campaigns to obtain the voting right for women. Helen Kendrick Johnson was opposed of this because she believed that that's what their husbands were there for. Alice Paul was a radical member of the women's suffrage movement, and she led hunger strikes, she picket fenced in front of the White House, and she led protests trying to really get the point across that women do deserve the right to vote. They achieved this through the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, and it gave the women the right to vote, finally. Okay, so now in women's roles, we have Margaret Sanger. She was involved in prohibition. She promoted contraceptives. She also created the Planned Parenthood, and she also, women went into the workforce to help support families. Next is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It's a big notorious disaster in American history that could have been avoided. It could have been avoided, but this happened due to the lack of like non-thorough procedures to uh, avoid such a big disaster such as a fire. And as a result, this brought about new laws and rules governing building construction. And the results of the disaster brought about new laws and rules governing. Okay, so now political reforms. Due to the Pendleton Act, this required that people in the government have some knowledge, or at least some position. So, for example, congressmen couldn't just have their say buddies join in just because they want to be a part of it. They have to know what they're doing. Okay, so now the Wisconsin Governor Robert Lafayette, he basically he led other states to follow the example for the increased vote of power to people in the ballot box. The three things that were done was the initiative, referendum, and recall. This allowed voters in a state that they may initiate or introduce legislation at any time, or that voters could force the legislature to place a bill before state voters for a vote of approval or disapproval. And also, this allowed voters to remove an elected official from office. Okay, so now on to economic reforms. We're going to be discussing the railroad abuses. So, a thing that was in place was the Interstate Commerce Commission that basically regulated railroads because of unfair business practices. And also the Hepburn Act, which was a stricter control over railroads and expanded powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission and supported labor reforms. The ICC can prosecute its own inquiries into violation of its regulations. And the Elkins Act strengthened federal legislation, outlawed preferential pricing, prohibited railroads from transporting goods as their own. Okay, now the trust and monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act. Its first law was to limit monopolies in the U.S., create a more fair competition in the workforce, and limit any takeovers of the Department of Merchandise. Okay, so now the Clayton Antitrust Act. This basically was passed in 1914. It outlawed unfair practices as price discrimination. Okay, so now the gold standard and the free silver. Gold bugs are basically supported by Republicans and big banks and big businesses. And a problem with this was having the money based off of gold is a fair repayment of debts versus the free silver or the silverites, who were supported by the Westerners, some Democrats and populists, with the slogan 16 to 1, meaning 16 ounces of silver equals 1 ounce of gold, and this led to an easier repayment of debts. Okay, so now African Americans during the Progressive Era. So, Birth of a Nation, the racist silent film, showed the history of the Ku Klux Klan. And Woodrow Wilson supported this film. And next is Ida B. Wells, who was a civil rights activist journalist. She was founder of the NAACP, and she led a campaign against lynching. So this is the first Great Migration where millions of blacks moved from the south to the north to get the opportunity to have a better lifestyle. Okay, so now Webb Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was more acceptant towards. Booker T. Washington was not as much assertive as Webb Du Bois was. He created the Tuskegee Institute, and he basically wanted
African American equality, for Americans after they're economically sound to be equal with whites. Where on the other hand, Webb Du Bois, he was more assertive and said that they should already have equality like now instead of just um, like when they're economically sound. Okay, so now towards the election of 1896, we have William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. Jennings Bryan was a Democrat. He was anti-tariff, and he was pro-silver standard. On the other hand, William McKinley was a Republican, pro-tariff, pro-business, and pro-gold standard. Okay, now, so, McKinley versus Bryan, it was imperialist versus anti-imperialist. McKinley's running mate was Teddy Roosevelt. He was very popular because of the Rough Riders. And in McKinley's time in office, he was very important because he was pro-imperialist. Okay, so in Roosevelt's administration, big stick policy was basically Roosevelt's belief that we should engage diplomacy and also maintain a strong military to back up the policy. And this allowed for the canal in Panama. And in Roosevelt's corollary, it stated that in future cases of department problems, the U.S. would take over and pay off debts. This keeping the Europeans on the side of the Atlantic. And also in Roosevelt's administration, he created the Square Deal, who basically embraced the 3 C's: control of the corporation, consumer protection, and conservation of the U.S.'s natural resources. And also, Roosevelt was also known as a trust buster.
Okay, now we're moving on to imperialism. For influences to imperialism, there was Seward's Folly, which was the purchase of Alaska from Russia. This added more land and available resources to the U.S. Social Darwinism was also an influence toward imperialism. It was basically survival of the fittest for humans, and that the belief that society can be improved. There were needs for new markets as well, and there was Anglo-Saxonism, which is basically white superiority in English-speaking countries. The Treaty of Kanagawa in 1888 was influence for the expansion in the Pacific. Basically, the treaty was it ended Japan's economic isolation, and it established an American consulate in Japan, and it helped secure American coaling rights in Japanese ports. The Big Sister policy was basically a policy that was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. It aimed to kind of rally up the Latin American nations behind U.S. leadership, and it helped open their markets to U.S. traders. In Hawaii, there's the last monarch for Queen Liliuokalani. She viewed kind of the idea of foreigners coming into her country and trying to take away like her resources and everything. In China, there was the Opium War, which was basically a war between Britain and China over trade rights. The Boxer Rebellion, this rebellion started in 1899 in Beijing, in China. It was started by a secret society of Chinese who opposed the quote-unquote foreign devils. This rebellion was later ended by the British troops. Now on to the Spanish-American War. In the Spanish-American War, Cubans were revolting against the Spanish. However, in this revolt, it was legal for Cubans to have weapons. So they basically just if they had the chance to steal a weapon, they could in order to use it in the war or the revolt. In this revolt was also guerrilla warfare, which basically they just use anything they can to harm the other people they were fighting against. America was interested in this because it kind of reminded us of when we were wanting to have our own independence. On the road to war, we put a lot of economic investments into Cuba, which was beneficial to us because it created a lot of businesses. The Delome letter was sent
to the U.S. president, and in the letter, it was stating how America showed